So I asked the question, how many of you this morning have a great understanding of what it feels like to wait for or to anticipate a miracle? In the Bible, the importance of miracles bear such evidence of divine power among those who experience it, who witness it. The narratives of miracles in the Bible, through their evidence and their power, were able to produce faith in those who would encounter the story, the witness of the Bible. And also, the miracles' importance in the Bible was that these accounts were able to confirm the word of faith that was spoken by God's prophets, by God's Son, Jesus the Christ. It is, as Pastor Ryan Kelly has shared, rarely are compassion and power present together in equal measure and in such perfect harmony as we see in Jesus. For often, compassion without power, it leaves us with sympathy, but not a rescuer. When there is power without compassion, somehow we may be provided a rescuer, but it tends to be one who is indifferent or impersonal. Jesus Christ was both. And that's a part of the narrative of the gospel that we experienced this morning. Now, in our bulletin, I just want to hasten to say that the caption on the front of this morning's bulletin, it isn't to test to see if you're a robot. It really just gave me a big laugh when one of our folks just sent an email and just noted that this past week. The question usually might be asked, how many traffic lights are there in this picture? Well, actually, it is a picture of a road that I walked along a few weeks ago. I walked along this road called Healing Way. And on Healing Way sits a brand new hospital representing the accessibility, advanced miracles of medicine in a post-millennial society, the work and the study of human science and what it means for society in need of miracles. And as I walked along that road, I did so because I had my dogs with me, and it was a beautiful day, and as a part of the walking, it gives something to me that I need, which is exercise. But it also gave me an opportunity to stand and to look at that beautiful new edifice and to think about all of the hope that people experience when they come down Healing Way, and praying that that miracle might come to them. It's a very personal story for me, because as I stood on that road and stood in front of the hospital and just reflected for a brief few minutes, I thought about how I've been waiting for the miracle of a cure for me and my issue of blood for 32 years now. This is the length of time since my diagnosis of diabetes. I came from a county in North Carolina where it has the second highest percentage of people living with diabetes. In 2019, the percentage was 16% of the residents in Edgecombe County, North Carolina, who live with diabetes. So as I stood along Healing Way and just pondered for a moment about what it means to be healed, I realized that I'm not the only person who understands that a road named Healing Way doesn't always lead to the miracle for which he or she are waiting for. But in Mark's gospel, this 5th chapter, sandwiched between the desperate stories of Jesus' exorcism of a legion of demons holding a man captive and unintelligible among the tombs in Gentile country, amid an appeal of a prominent leader of the synagogue and a woman whose chronic illness has exhausted her resources but not her faith, there is the hope of God's liberation that is found on Jesus' healing way. The narrative of Mark, it represents the communities that certainly were aware of those who had studied the body, the human body, had studied the certain phenomena of illnesses. There's even the evidence of the Dr. Susruta, who was a part of the ancient Indian society. He was a physician. His name meant well heard, and certainly he was. This father of surgery, as he had been referred to, he had published a treatise of over 184 chapters containing descriptions of more than 1,000 diseases. His study of more than 700 medicinal plants, his preparation of more than 64 mineral sources based upon what he was able to learn from plants and animal life. The scripture speaks of this Jairus whose daughter was sick, and how he wakes his way to Jesus, who had traveled on the other side of the lake. And in between the story of Jairus' daughter is the story of the woman. In the King James Version, it says the issue of blood. And I tend to like that description because it doesn't limit or narrow our perspective about what the possibilities may have been for this woman who had suffered for so long. But in Mark's Gospel, chapter 5, Jesus and his disciples, they travel across both sides of the lake that was familiar to the people as a natural boundary between the Gentile and the Jewish cultures. Like a great physician, Jesus extending house calls. Jesus' healing way spanned across the cultural and racial divides. Jesus' healing way was a path to faith, illuminating the truth that our destinies are inextricably bound by how ethically our systems and institutions care and minister to the human conditions of physical and mental illness, poverty, marginalization, and isolation. Mark wants his readers to interpret these two distinctive accounts in the light of each other. His theological sandwich, is common in the larger narratives of Mark, especially when he writes and shares the stories of the women who were involved in Jesus' ministry. When Jesus crosses the other side, he is crossed back into Jewish country. And the Gospel of Mark wants his readers to know that Jesus was not always opposed by every member of Jewish leadership. And Jairus was a good example. Jairus was one who certainly had prominence, who certainly had influence, and he sought the popular healer to assist his daughter. And so as he asked of Jesus to accompany him to his daughter, the place where his daughter would be, somehow the travel is interrupted. The Bible says that Jesus didn't have to go that way. Jesus didn't have to go by the way of the Gadarenes, and he didn't have to travel through the Gentile country and make his way back, but he did. And as Jesus does, he encounters the crowds that pressed against him and the woman who needs to get to Jesus. And as the Greek speaks about this woman, and it speaks about her in terms of her illness and her issue of bleeding, but it also speaks about the fact of what the gospel does for every person. Just as a woman determines with faith that she's going to reach out and touch Jesus, she's going to make her way through the crowd and press her way in order to get to Jesus. Jesus' healing way has the important message that the church is to offer the world a compassion and a power. Not ours, but Christ. It reminds me of the Latin American theologians and the African American theologian of James Cone and their writings about the Jesus healing as narratives that proclaim a gospel of liberation. It's a liberation that brings about a certain existential change. Just as the woman understood that the changes in her body, so Jesus recognized the change in his body. And Mark would like for his readers to recognize Jesus' active role in her healing. Jesus asked the question, who has touched him? Fear, not boldness, provoked the woman to come forward. She was unsure of what she would encounter by opening herself to the public. There were all sorts of laws about impurities. Perhaps that had everything to do with the amount of suffering that she had endured, in addition to seeking the cures from the doctors that she had consulted. In this particular society at this time in the Hellenistic period of history, quite often the physicians, which were noted to bring about a certain successful treatment of their patients, it was up to the people to get to the doctor. But those who were of a lesser position in society, these were the folks who would often become those who would consult the doctors, the snake handlers, so to speak, the snake oil handlers, so to speak, who would make their way into the different places within the communities. And so Mark needed for his readers to understand that Jesus was different. The woman could not touch Jesus and be changed and Jesus not know it. But Jesus calls out this woman not because he needs to embarrass her, not because he wants her to feel as if she didn't steal something from him. That wasn't it. The gospel that liberates is Jesus' healing way. And so Jesus asked of her to come forward, because what Jesus does is he allows this woman and what she has encountered to have a face and a voice. And in so doing, there is a liberation that occurs. And then, as Jesus is opening the way for this woman who has suffered for so many years, while he was still speaking, words of affirmation and confirmation to this daring woman whose faith had made her well, there was bad news for Jairus. Your daughter has died. And Jesus' powerful words of both and compassion to Jairus was, do not fear, only believe. Jesus challenged Jairus to hold on to the faith that had led him to the healer in the first place. Similar to the earlier healing stories, Jesus, who has touched the young lady, unlike earlier healing accounts, Jesus speaks the Aramaic here. Talitha kum, little lamb. Culturally, Jairus' daughter, she was approaching the age for customary marriage. Jesus' healing way illustrates that the gospel of God is to be an intergenerational mission. Not only has Jesus ministered to those who were of the age, but now Jesus has ministered to the very young. One aged woman needed for her bleeding to stop, which restored her life. Another young woman had life restored so that she can continue to bleed and eventually produce life. Yet in this first century of Jewish culture, with these rituals of his purity, defining who was clean and who wasn't, Jesus' power and compassion, even if not with a name, his healing way allowed the faith of the woman and of Jairus' daughter to provide faces and voices to a system that had brought indignity and suffering. And Jesus liberated them all. Mark's Gospel, chapter 5, he begins to show us these experiences, these conditions of desperation and helplessness. He shows us disciples in a ship upon a sea, a demonic captive by the caves and the tombs, a woman who was bleeding and could not find her help, Jairus' daughter who had died and who Jesus had to speak the words and show her life again, that Jesus' healing way is a way maker. The liberating power of Jesus that brings the end to the suffering and fear of the human condition, it speaks that Jesus is a miracle worker. The opportunities to consider the infinite ways that God's power overcomes the obstacles that human society consider as norms, it shares that Jesus' healing way is that of a promise keeper. The opportunities to consider the infinite ways that God's power allows us to experience love, to experience life, and to experience liberty, even when there are laws that speak something otherwise. It provides that Jesus' healing way is one who is light in the darkness. The outcast, the noble, the Jews and the Gentile, the men and the women, the poor and the wealthy, the sick and the able, they speak of Jesus' healing way, that he is for us Emmanuel, God with us. He is the one who brings about the healing of the nations. He is the one who brings about the healing of the heart. He is the one who brings about the healing of those who are brokenhearted and cast down. He is the one who brings the healing to those who even experience it, not in the bodies, but in their souls. It is the work of science and medicine that heals the body, but it is the work of Christ's salvation that shall always heal the soul.